Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Startup Talks. Today's episode is a bit unique as we aim to get insights into the startup ecosystem in Pakistan through analyzing data. And to do that, we are joined by Philip Bahoshy, founder and CEO of MAGNiTT. It is the first startup data platform and a go-to place for founders and investors across emerging venture markets. Philip's knack for data is evident from his time at prestigious institutions like INSEAD with an MBA and a BSc in economics from the London School of Economics. Previously, he has been involved with Oliver Wyman and Barclays Wealth, advising on strategic initiatives. Having lived in the UAE over a decade and a firm believer that data should drive decisions, Philip is passionate about cross-pollinating entrepreneurship ecosystems across emerging venture markets. So, Philip, thank you very much for coming on to Startup Talks. How are you doing, my friend?
Doing great. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
That's great. So, to start it off on a lighter note, are you a fan of the game of cricket?
I am a fan of the game of cricket. I actually went to the cricket last week. I
Okay.
went to England, Australia,
Mhm.
and I might be going to the final.
Okay, so is England meeting Pakistan in the finals then?
And we'll have to wait and see.
All right. So, Philip, uh, I've been following MAGNiTT for quite some time now, and especially for me, it is a go-to place to get all the answers on data for funding and this new startup coming into the ecosystem. There was a report recently, I believe it was last week, about the the top three under three in Pakistan, under 3 million, that is. And it's just added two more yesterday and today. Let's start from there. What do you think is the Pakistan ecosystem? How's it shaping up, in your opinion?
I think it's extremely positive. I think having been fortunate enough to start covering Pakistan,
Mhm.
again, Magnet, just to put it into context, covers all emerging markets. We're currently looking at Africa, Middle East, Pakistan, Turkey. So one of the things that we have is by taking a bird's eye view of the emerging market space,
Mhm.
we don't look to focus specifically on a country in silo. We try to understand what the trends are across all the emerging market space. And interestingly, right now, it's a record amount of capital that's being deployed at a global level. It's a record amount of capital that's being deployed at an emerging market level. And clearly in Pakistan, a similar trend is happening. In fact, if you take the total amount of investment of the last 4 years, it amounts to the total amount of investment that has already been deployed in Pakistan year to date. And investment activity is very strong. I think that there was a lot of momentum that was building in the Pakistani ecosystem in the last 2 years specifically. I mean, that was where I really started hearing prior to COVID that there were conferences and events that were taking place. I think COVID almost stopped some of that activity because people weren't able to travel and come and attend this focus. But virtually, as platforms similar to yourselves, there's been a lot of activity in trying to promote awareness of startups, a lot of awareness of the activity that's happening to try and spur on
Mhm.
investment. And as a result, you are seeing a record year of capital being deployed in Pakistan, a record number of transactions that are happening, a record number of international investors interested in the space. You've even had a couple of exits that have taken place this year, which for a couple of years hadn't taken place. So I think from that perspective, a lot of progress that's happening, albeit it's still very early, and I expect that trend to continue into the years ahead.
Okay. And uh, taking a critical view on things, on investments especially, what do you think is the main reason behind international investors uh, coming in heavy into the ecosystem? Is it a FOMO kind of effect, or it's just the regional trend?
So there's two things that I always say. I had this conversation yesterday with a leading Saudi um, entity, and we were saying, why is it that people are more interested in Pakistan, for instance, than potentially even US or Southeast Asian than in the Middle East? And I think there's a couple of effects. the size of the population in Pakistan and the size of the opportunity from an infrastructure perspective is huge. More than 220 million people, single country, single geography, regulatory framework. I think that given technology is now currently being embraced, there's huge amount of disruption that can be done using technology to help solve for acute infrastructure, financial, and the likes pain points. I think that there's a huge amount of talent. We already know historically many developers and the engineering staff of many companies that are based in the Middle East have come from Pakistan, if not are currently based in Pakistan. And so the tech talent that exists there is quite big. But I think at a regional level, there is more interest. So for instance, if we take the Middle East, more than 290 different institutions have made investments in MENA-based companies in this year. That's more than any previous year. And 40% of those are coming from outside of the MENA region, the highest percentage of interest from international investors. Now, if you add the emerging market space, I think that given the record amounts of capital that's being deployed into venture capital, into startups at a global level, people are starting to look for new opportunities for bigger return on investments. And when you look at the valuations that are happening, albeit if you speak to investors in Pakistan, they'll say that valuations are going through the roof in Pakistan relative to other geographies and relative to other ecosystems. They're still a lot lower than what you would find in the US or potentially Southeast Asia or Europe. And therefore, when they look at it opportunistically as size of market, infrastructure pain points, potential of growth, and the valuations, I think it becomes extremely interesting. Let's not also forget the very strong expat community that Pakistanis have in Silicon Valley, in the US, in emerging markets, in Southeast Asia, who are working in technology in those geographies with the like of the Pak Launch community that's there, which is extremely vibrant, really focused in supporting the ecosystem in Pakistan. I think that's why you're seeing this continued increasing trend.
I believe Atif Aman and Indus Valley Capital has also a big role to play there with regards to the Wapistani factor, so to say, that is playing a big role there. Now, Philip, one thing in Pakistan, of course, Pakistan has broken almost all records for the past 5 years in just this year. And we are still seeing announcements almost on a weekly basis. This week also there have been two, and we've still got a month and a half to go. There were predictions of crossing 200 million, then the bar was set at 215, and we crossed 300. Where do you think this is all going to end up by 31st of December?
Honestly, I don't think that it matters so much in so much of putting a specific figure. I look at trends. And so if there's an increase in capital that was deployed, if there's more transactions that are happening, if there's continued increased interest, that's the story. The figures act as benchmarks. And I think by end of year, we will be reaching close to $300 million of investment and probably around 60 to 70 number of transactions. But for me, the real story is that this is incrementally higher than we saw in the last 2-3 years. Transactions have continued to grow steadily. These are positive for the maturity of the ecosystem. And this is with half the year still having been somewhat COVID affected. Now that we're seeing people travel again, now that we're seeing people cross borders, the thing that really excites me, and you mentioned this at the beginning, cross-pollination for me is key. I think that selfishly speaking as MAGNiTT, one of the things that I keep on saying is if we can raise awareness internationally of the emerging market space, more and more big name international investors will get excited about how a Pakistani startup can scale to Turkey, can scale to Egypt, can scale to Saudi Arabia, and get into much bigger multiples of potential exits. The same can be said for when we start hearing stories of Saudi companies scaling into Pakistan, whether organically or inorganically. And then you have that whole mafia effect of PayPal and Kareem and the multiplier effect of future founders, future rounds of investments, and future success stories. So to answer your question, I don't know, the number might be 300, it might be 350, it may be 400, depending on the potential pipeline. But the true answer is, as long as the numbers are showing progressive growth year on year, and for several quarters at a time, it's showing positive signs of maturity of the ecosystem.
All right. And again, looking at analytics, if you compare Pakistan to the regional economies, that is, the number of deals in Pakistan have been quite high in comparison to other countries. And probably because of the fact that Pakistan is still coming out of its nascent stages. Now, why do you think is that so, or do you predict that this may slow down the number of deals in the future?
I think that the total number of transactions will continue to grow. I mean, again, we're talking about a 220 million population. If you only take a small percentage of that as potential founders that are building companies that could get potential investments, it's a huge base. When you look at the MENA region, I give you an example. The UAE was the leading startup hub 3-4 years ago by number of transactions and by total amount of capital. Egypt then surpassed UAE by total number of transactions because of the size of the population there, 100 million, 120 million, very strong youth drive towards innovation. The number of opportunities for investment continues to grow. So I think while the percentage year on year of growth has been, outside of Turkey, the ones that we cover, the highest increase year over year, again, it's coming from a slightly lower base. And I expect that that trend will continue into the year ahead as you find more people. I think what you see by the success stories and the talks and all of these things is people are getting inspired. People are wanting to start companies. People are wanting to try and drive innovation. And that will naturally lead to more pipeline. One thing I have, and again, I'm no expert in Pakistan. I'm really still educating myself through these discussions and through these conversations and really building up my awareness of the ecosystem. But one thing that I do think is always important is how do you build the foundation of a startup ecosystem? If you think of it as a little bit of a funnel or a triangle, you need a very solid base. And what the MENA region did prior to COVID was really invest in accelerator programs, incubators. I know that there's the National Center for Incubators and etc. But to get investment there, how do you get the likes of Plug and Play, Techstars, 500 Startups, Y Combinator, local accelerator programs? I know that there are a couple of that exist to really help spearhead the early base of the ecosystem that can then funnel further investments down the line. And if that happens, you'll only see multiples of transactions that will be happening in the Pakistani ecosystem.
Okay. Uh, uh, just this week, through the incubation centers, 500 startups was there, right? There are a lot more people coming. I know for a fact that Teddy Himmler is going to be here by the end of this month. And
Yep.
I've spoken to some VCs as well, and some of them are actually going to be here on Startup Talks as well in the coming days. Uh, in Pakistan, uh, the trend right now is usually centered around pre-seed, seed, and Series A rounds mostly. Uh, if you look at data, because I know you at MAGNiTT you like analyzing data, what do you think is a good time frame to see bigger rounds for startups to get into Series B, C's, and things like that?
I don't think it's a matter of magnet. I think it's a matter of a maturity of startups. Naturally, companies, as they continue to scale and grow, require further capital to be able to meet those ambitions. And again, it goes back to that triangle funnel. You need companies at the early stage to get investment to get to the next stage. Then they have bigger requirements for funding to scale and grow. And therefore, the more Series A startups that receive funding, normally runway when you do a typical fundraise can be 12 to 18 months of runway of capital. So then naturally in 12 months, you'll probably be fundraising again, and there'll be announcements of Series B rounds and then the Series B and Series C. So I think almost one thing that we noticed in the region in the Middle East, and I can't speak for Pakistan, but when we were looking at the Middle East, patience is almost a little bit of a virtue. People want to see the unicorn immediately, but it takes time to get to a unicorn. You can have a unicorn valuation by giving a company $500 million and valuing them at $1 billion, but is that sustainable for the company? Or do they need to go through the progression of growth to actually become a company that is sustainable at that level? So I think with time, with maturity, with growth of startups, with more capital coming into the ecosystem, with more international interest coming in and playing a role potentially at later stage, you will see more of those deals in the way as we've seen now, more record number of Series B, C, late stage investments in the MENA region than we have done for the last 5 years. There was a period when we started MAGNiTT, and when we did the research reports, we always used to have a black column which was investments in Souk, because it was more than $100 million. Then we used to tag it as investments in Souk and Kareem, because they were the only two that would skew the data as investments more than $100 million. Now we have a solid mega deals, more than $100 million, because you are seeing a steady flow of companies that are receiving that late stage investment. And I think that that will similarly start taking place in Pakistan as it continues to mature as an ecosystem.
Fingers crossed. Hopefully, if I'm to do this talk again, say sometime around in November next year, maybe we might be talking about some B's and C's.
I'm sure.
Yeah. And now, Philip, uh, uh, moving on to mergers and acquisitions, right? There's been one case of a trucker in Pakistan, right? But if you look at certain spaces like the B2B commerce and fintech, especially with regards to payment facilitators, these two, and of course e-commerce, these three are the main spaces that are attracting most of the investments, especially B2B commerce. There are so many players now, Dastagir, Tajir, so many others. It's hard to even remember names now. Oh, uh, uh, in my opinion, personally, I think mergers are going to happen, right, in the near future. Probably sometime next year, we might start hearing news. What do you think? Are mergers with the regional players? Is that also a possibility, in your opinion?
I think that as people continue to look for opportunities for growth, the natural progression is as companies in potentially MENA, Turkey, Southeast Asia, look to capture new markets, you always ask yourself the question, do you build it yourself or
Mm-hmm.
do you acquire?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if there are companies that, one of the points I made on the pack launch thing is one of the challenges for all of us, myself included, is to really understand, how does one operate in Pakistan? How easy is it to set up from scratch? What is the regulatory framework to
Mm-hmm.
be able to do that? What are the licensing requirements? And so if you're a well-funded company in another market and you're looking at the opportunity, you ask yourself the question, in the same way as when Uber came to compete with Careem in the Middle East, do you go about doing it yourself, or does it get to a point where it's actually easier or probably more efficient to be able to acquire and merge the company to make yourself into a bigger proposition? And I think as companies begin to identify Pakistan as a market of real potential, I wouldn't be surprised if more of those type of transactions happen. And it's a win for everyone. It's a win for the founders. It's a win for the ecosystem. It's a win for the employees that can be part of a growth story and an exit story. And as that kind of confidence builds within the founders, who knows if it's not the other way around? The Pakistani startups start identifying potential merger oppositions in other GCC countries or in other markets like Turkey. And so it's about a bit of back and to and fro, but I would not be surprised if that trend happens into the years ahead.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at investments in Pakistan, most of them, the heavier chunk has been from international investors. Sitting in Pakistan, it's safe for me to say that the investment climate here is more into traditional investment options like the stock market and real estate and things like that. But things have actually started to change here. Um, uh, uh, s- some of the critics over here argue that all this is happening because of there's a bit of a FOMO here in the market. Do you think that's true, or is that the one?
Absolutely. I think there's two aspects, right? So I can, again, I can't speak as an expert in the Pakistani mindset, but I can speak to what's happened in the Middle East. If you go back to when I started MAGNiTT, let's go back 5 years, for instance.
Mhm.
It was a hot space. There was interesting press around it. But from a family office perspective, from an individual's perspective, from a corporate's perspective,
Mhm.
when you have stock markets, when you have traditional businesses and you have real estate, it is very difficult to justify why you would get into companies that have not seen exits, that have not had liquidity events. And let's remember that venture is not charity, and it requires a liquidity effect for a realized return on your investment, not a paper return on that investment. And so when VCs were raising money and speaking to LPs, the question is always, what's your track record? Where are we going to see these exits happen? When investors are looking at the space, they want to understand what's the light at the end of the tunnel. Then you start hearing this crescendo of activity. Souk announces the acquisition by Amazon. Uber comes along and acquires Careem. InstaShop gets acquired. You get Hunger Station, or different companies like Talabat being acquired in the region. All of a sudden, these investors who wish they'd been a part of these investment rounds and were very likely to have been given the opportunity but turned them down, start going, we don't want to miss out on the next one. And therefore, that FOMO factor is extremely influential in driving the investor appetite. But let's not against the fact that the regulatory framework for investment also is something that needs to be analyzed and reviewed. Here, huge amount of work has been done to try and change bankruptcy law. So a lot of people that are making investment in companies can be personally liable if the company is likely to fail. And that doesn't encourage a person or a company to invest in a startup if the likelihood of failure is between 80 and 90%. And when you look at the structuring of those type of investments, how easy is it to enter and what incentives are in place to do that? And so it's easy to say that it's FOMO alone, but there is also a regulatory and kind of legal framework discussion that needs to happen to either make it easier for investments to take place and or to try and incentivize people to put their money into venture as an asset class.
I believe taking on from this last bit of your comment, I believe you'll agree with me that Pakistan is actually doing a great job at moving around and making adjustments in their regulatory framework. And plus, it is also doing, in my opinion personally, it's doing a wonderful job at actually portraying the positive image of investments in Pakistan, especially if you look at the Expo 2020, the recently held conference in Turkey as well last week. These things are all happening. But if you look at Pakistan and compare it to regional economies, Saudi is also coming on very strong. Turkey is also coming on very strong. Where do you see all of these emerging markets to balance out in the near future?
I think it's so positive. I think that there's always healthy competition. I think that if it means that it creates better companies across all of them, that it creates, and again, remember that venture is still very small.
Yeah.
While I'm very happy to be able to report that it's record amounts of capital being deployed in Pakistan, it's $270 million. The
Mm.
record amounts of capital being in MENA, close to 2 billion. But when you see the amount of capital that's been deployed in the US, when you see how much has been deployed in Europe, Latin America, another emerging market,
Yeah.
is close to 5, 6, 7x the amount of capital that's been deployed in the whole of the Middle East.
Yeah.
And therefore, if there's more companies that are growing, more opportunities that develop, and increasing the size of the pie for venture and technology as an asset class, it's healthy all round. And the ability to break down, in my opinion, when we talk about the growth of these economies, one thing is very important. The role of government isn't necessarily to spearhead investment in companies, but what it is to try and make it easier for companies to scale.
Yeah.
And scale is the name of the game. Being able to provide market entry and access to more customers is an area that can help facilitate. So the bigger these ecosystems are, the easier it is for companies to transfer into new markets. Everybody wins. And I don't think it's necessarily a competition by geography. As I mentioned earlier, selfishly, it's if the emerging venture market space continues to grow, it becomes more appealing for international investors as an asset class, and that's a win for everyone.
All right. And now, Philip, I know you probably hear news on Pakistan. Of course, data keeps flowing into MAGNiTT with regards to analytics. But with apart from the analytical angle, you probably get news stories about things happening in Pakistan. Um, uh, in your opinion, what do you think are the changes that need to be implemented to accelerate this growth that the economy is seeing right now?
So again, I don't claim to be an expert or advocate that I can support in saying what has to change and not change in Pakistan. It's not my role necessarily to do that. And my focus is very much on looking at the data and the venture capital space. I do go back to what I have learned in the MENA region, and I can only say that that can be applied across all geographies.
Mm-hmm.
The three areas that people always talk about is scalability. How can you make access, whether it's for companies to come into Pakistan from outside of the region or for Pakistani companies to scale into other geographies, being able to make market access a top priority and make it simple, clear, and identifiable on how a company is able to do that. Second is a company is only ever as good as the quality of the people that are working in it, and access to talent, training of talent, educating people on what it is to work in a startup over a corporate is something that takes time, it takes investment, and it takes learning lessons to be able to create more people that are applicable into that space. And then third is obviously funding is a key requirement to growth of these companies, being able to support the funders, whether it's through fund of funds and really unlocking their ability to invest, or being able to invest in more companies by making it appealing for those companies to receive investment is key. So it remains always the three key incentives of channeling market access, talent, and funding to be able to see more and more growth in the ecosystem.
All right. Uh, I think, Philip, these are some very enlightening comments here. We're because I try and keep it to half an hour, 35 minutes. I think we'll end it just here. Hopefully, we can do it again sometime. And
With pleasure.
just like you are passionate about cross-pollinating the regional ecosystems, so am I, right? If you obviously you come across many startups, many people do want to reach out to you. If you feel that they should be and featured on startup talks, please do recommend them.
Will do.
Thank you very much for being here. It was nice talking to you. Hopefully, we can do it again sometime.
Thank you very much. Have a great day and good luck with Startup Talks.
You too. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye bye.